Self-sufficiency, that is the topic of tonight's Byline. Can you make it on your own? Are you capable of feeding yourself, housing yourself, providing for your family? Well, for generations, the answer for the vast majority of Canadians was yes. Sure, we've always had people that could not look after themselves, and that's why we've had charity. It's why we built the social safety net. But the social safety net, built to help those that cannot help themselves, it's been expanded over the years, and now the left wants to wrap it around every single one of us. See, the left has a message for you, one that plays out in a couple of stories today, and that message is, you can't look after yourself. You need government. Without government, you will fail. It's a message I reject, but let's be clear, this message is out there. Two stories from today's headlines illustrate this. The push to double the Canada Pension Plan payments and thus double the Canada Pension Plan premiums we pay, and the trouble that Industry Minister James Moore is in for saying it isn't his job to feed his neighbor's child. In both stories, the message from the left is, you need government. You can't make it without them. Now, James Moore is a man that I've clashed with many times. We don't see eye to eye on a whole range of issues. So when I stand up for Moore, it's a shock to plenty of people, Moore included. But I have to stand up for the man because he's being beaten up for speaking a plain truth. Moore was approached by News 1130 reporter Sarah Norman, who stated child poverty is up in BC. Then she asked Moore, what's the federal government going to do about it? Now, first off, Norman, who's covering politics, should know that social programs are a provincial responsibility. She obviously doesn't, but Moore tells her.
Poverty, what is it we plan to do? We're not going to usurp the province's jurisdiction of that.
Now, Moore then went on to point to jobs growth, economic growth across Canada, both of which lift people out of poverty. Didn't matter to this dogged superstar reporter. She pushed on by saying that some kids are going to school hungry.
Well, obviously, nobody wants kids to go to school hungry, but yeah, certainly we want to make sure that kids go to school to full belly. But is that always the government's job, to be there to serve people their breakfast? You know, empowering families with more power and resources so that they can feed their own children is, I think, a good thing.
Now, in her written story, Norman cut out the part at the end that, well, she just went with the angle that the feds don't care about the poor. Well, sorry if this sounds harsh, but it is not the government's job to feed everyone their breakfast. That's the first point. It is the job of parents to feed their children. And Moore talked about empowering parents. He talked about creating the conditions for jobs growth. But because he said it isn't his job to feed his neighbor's kid, well, the poverty industry is up in arms. They think this sounds cold because they don't think you can feed your own kids without government help. First off, if it was up to government to step in, does it make sense that the feds out of Ottawa would run a local breakfast program in Vancouver? That would be like having the feds fix my sidewalk. It's not their job, and the reporter that started this and all the other media folks that followed should know better. Maybe they do know that it's not Ottawa's job, but they're so wedded to this progressive idea that we can't succeed without government. I don't know which it is. It's the same sentiment behind the push to double the CPP. Canadians have been told for years that the CPP will not give them the retirement of their dreams, but it wasn't designed to make sure that we could all travel around the world in our golden years either. But today there's a push for an expanded government pension plan. Federal Finance Minister Jim Flaherty spent his day meeting with provincial counterparts. Some, like Ontario's Charles Sousa, a Liberal, well, they want more government involvement. Here's what Sousa said. Over 50% of Ontarians do not have a pension plan. They're going to be fully reliant on CPP and OAS to provide for them. And at $12,000 a year, that's insufficient. So he discounts personal savings, home equity, RSPs, and other savings tools. So too does much of the media. Chris Hall at CBC wrote an analysis piece on the weekend that said Canadians aren't saving enough in their RSPs, so the government needs to step in. Quote, in other words, Canadians won't save for retirement unless they're forced to. Expanding the Canada Pension Plan guarantees a better retirement income for the future of every Canadian. They don't think you can do it without government help. Apparently, they don't believe in Canadians. But I do. When Alexander Mackenzie crossed the country mapping out the terrain, he didn't have a government program. As Canada was settled by wave after wave of immigrants in its early years, it was the individual farmer and their family, not the government, that cleared land, moving boulders and logs bigger than anything you've ever seen. When radio came to Canada, it wasn't government that spread stations across the country, but local clubs and entrepreneurs fascinated with this new technology. Insulin was developed in Canada, not with the government program, but one man's dogged determination. And even our national pastime, hockey, came to be without government help, as did the Timmy's double-double that goes so well with the game. Canada is a land of people that know how to look after themselves, know how to build great things, not because of government, but in spite of government. Remember that the next time a progressive tells you you can't do it on your own. And that's the byline. Joining me now for further discussion on this is John Robson. And John, I want to pick up on an issue that to me says there's a failing in our education system, and that's that the reporter that started this and all the media people that came after it don't seem to know that there's an actual division of powers in our Constitution. I think this is vital. They're asking the federal government, what are you going to do about a social problem? That is a provincial area of jurisdiction, and someone covering politics should know this.
They should know that, and they should also have some idea why. Because I noticed this, that whenever there's some problems identified in Canada, we get strident calls for a national strategy, as though central planning had been vindicated in the last century, not the reverse. It doesn't matter what it is. We're eating too much salt. We need a national salt strategy. It's an outrage that we don't have a national salt strategy. We're an international laughingstock. Head injuries. It's obviously a very serious issue. We need a national head injury strategy. Why do we need a national head injury strategy? Why don't we need doctors and sports associations? Why don't we decentralize so that people can find creative solutions at the local level and then share them? But this is totally lost. That's why some of this stuff is in the hands of the provinces, is so that they can they can experiment and they can adapt to local conditions. So yeah, to understand the formal law, you also have to understand the reasoning. But that reasoning goes a step further. Why decentralized? Because very often the people most directly involved in a situation are the ones best placed to fix it, by the best command of resources, the best understanding. And I don't, with James Moore, one of the things I don't understand about conservatives, how you can stake your career on conservatism and be so ill-versed in it that you stumble over your own tongue on obvious points. When he says, is it my job to feed my neighbor's children? Does he mean me, the minister, or me, the human being? Because he made no reference to charity, to the idea that this might best be handled by communities. So he ended up just saying, skinny kid over there is not my issue. I mean, he's playing right into his opponent's hands, and then that chuckle at the end of it. Who needed that?
Granted, Moore handled this badly.
Yeah.
But in Canadian political discussion today, the idea that charity might fix a problem is also foreign. We need a government solution. There must be a government solution. No, there doesn't need to be. A charity can do a much better job of feeding the poor, clothing the naked, housing the homeless than government can.
Of course it can, and I know that, and you know that. Why doesn't James Moore know that? Why does he portray the choices between an expansive government program and chuckling indifference to the plight of others?
Why didn't the reporter have a clue?
Fine.
I mean, let's get off James Moore for a second.
Why was he so wrong-footed? Why doesn't he know the history of charity? I remember Marvin
let's get off James Moore for a second. No, let's get off James Moore for a second and talk about the fact that this was driven by a reporter that didn't understand his original premise, which was this is provincial jurisdiction. Then goes with a gotcha headline that's picked up and repeated ad nauseum by other media until he actually is forced to apologize.
He wasn't forced to apologize. He chose to apologize because he wouldn't stick to his guns. And I want to bring up this story. Marvin Olasky wrote this book, The Tragedy of American Compassion, about the extensive role of private charity in the United States and how it was crowded out by government programs that cost more, did far less good materially, and were also destructive of the efforts of those in need to better themselves. And I remember one of the stories he told said some able-bodied young man in the 19th century needs a place to stay, basically what we would call homeless, and they'd go to the shelter and they'd say, fine, we've got a bed for you, we'll feed you, but before you do that, you're going to chop some wood, and we're going to use some of it to cook your meal, and we're going to give some of it to somebody who is not able to fend for themselves. So here's a guy on relief, the first night in the shelter, he's already helped somebody else. He's already been given back his sense of self-worth to some extent, his dignity. He's been shown something useful he can do for someone else. He's been put back to some extent on his own 2 feet. Government programs don't do that. They can't do that. They can't make you chop wood. They can't discern between the deserving and undeserving poor because of this requirement to treat everybody equally before the law. So maybe you have a last-ditch government safety net, but if all that money that's been hoovered up by the welfare state and spent not so much on bureaucracy as on programs that hurt people instead of helping them. If all of that had been left in the hands of Canadians, but they were told, you must look after, yes, you must feed your neighbor's kid, there would be a huge success. There's already a successful social network in this country privately, but it would be so much bigger because we'd all know that charity doesn't mean making somebody else pay. It means reaching into your own pocket. Then that's the message we need to get out.
John, thanks so much.